context currently of high complexity and uncertainty, such as the one we live in today, and how they are, if they are more challenging or not, and to what extent for SMEs, I guess it depends. One of the aspects we focus on here in the work that we've done is adaptability. So if you think about changing context, this is of course relevant. And when we say adaptability, we're looking at two different things. The first one is resilience. So that means, how do the SMEs react when they are exposed to external shocks, right? You could say COVID-19 pandemic and others. And what we see is that in terms of resilience, actually, SMEs are to some extent at a disadvantage compared to larger companies, right? They have smaller cash buffers. They tend to have weaker supply chains capabilities. They tend also across the board to have lower uptake of digital tools and technologies, especially if you compare to bigger company. So when you look at resilience, they might be at a disadvantage, especially in a context where things are changing so quickly. But the other part of the adaptability is the question of agility. And here it's very interesting, because if you look at agility, here it is about not absorbing shocks. It's about the capacity to seize the opportunities when they arise. And in that regard, SMEs are actually doing quite well. So the fact that they tend to be quite well positioned in terms of agility, especially compared to bigger company. They tend to be more nimble. They are smaller structures. It tends to be, an SME is a bit more flat than a big organization. And they tend to be the decision makers closer to the market. You have these feedback loops that are much more short with what happens on the ground. And this gives them actually a high level of agility. So yes, in a way, I would say it doesn't make the context not challenging. It is challenging, but they actually have this very high level of agility. And usually when things change quite quickly, if they manage things quite well, they could actually come out on top with the right approach. What are the essential pillars of future readiness that SMEs need to develop? There are three, and these are the following pillars. So, of course, the basics, as every company, and that applies for an SME, they are in business, and the one most important thing for them, and the most basic thing, is that they need to be doing well financially, right? So here it means they need to be able to sustain on the long term good financial growth, and that's one of the core. It's one of the three pillars of future readiness of SMEs. The second one is what we call societal impact. And here, what we're saying is that if you want to be well positioned in the future as an SME, growth and financials is not going to be enough, right? Of course, it's a prerequisite, but these companies, these SMEs, they will also need to have a positive impact around them. And here, what's interesting, of course, we talk about very often about the license to operate, and this is what it is, right? And the pressure here is actually increasing. What we see is that actually a lot of SMEs still see this to some extent as a bit of a nice to have, or something that they don't have the bandwidth to focus on. But what we see also more generally in the world is that the pressure for positive societal impact increases, and this manifests in different ways, on sustainability, on ESG, on inclusion, and others. And you see the pressure come from the consumer that want products and services that are kind of in line with these principles. You also see the regulation that is shifting, right? So the policies and the requirements in the law, in a way, is changing and pushing companies, including SMEs, to be more aligned with this. And also, what we see is that it increasingly also helps this shift also. Being more in line and having that societal impact also unlocks new opportunities. For instance, access to different type of capital and funds. So the second aspect here is really this question of, okay, you need to be doing well, but to some extent you will have to be doing some sort of good if you want to be thriving and future ready for the future. And the last one is the one we mentioned before, is around adaptability. And here it's that combination of the resilience to the shocks, but also the ability to seize opportunities as they emerge. And so this is really what are the pillars of this future readiness. What we wanted to do is to say, okay, so, but what is driving this? Because it's good to know what you should be in the future, but what's more important is what should you focus on so that you can get there. And here, when we looked at the high level as kind of the drivers and the factors that drive a company, an SME, to this state, you could say, of future readiness, Yeah, there are three things, three drivers. The first one, we call it orientation. So this is in a way the culture and the style of an organization. And this is the style and the culture that defines in a way how these SMEs approach very important decisions. And this is actually, this question of orientation is quite important. Behind that, you see things like innovativeness, risk-taking, or the level of autonomy that different individuals have in the organization. And all of this together forms that orientation, that type of style and culture. And this is actually very important to drive future readiness across the board, from adaptability to societal impact and growth. The other big driver is the question of the business models, right? So here, the ones that will be doing well, what will drive them is really having the right business models in place. But here also, what was interesting is seeing that what's important is the ability to reconfigure these business models, to reallocate resources quite quickly, etc. So that's another key driver. And finally, what we saw that was also interesting is the question of networks. And this is another big driver. So it's not just having these relationships and these networks, it's having the right one and also having the ability to engage them when you need them, because what we see is that they're very useful actually to tap into resources for companies. These resources could be knowledge, or it could be financing or different type of resource. But in a way, future readiness really has these three pillars and also have those three drivers of orientation, business models, and networks. So how can the SME actually, often that have some kind of few resources, how can they deal with this tension of development for the future, but also in a way that has this positive impact? And I think there's two levels here. The first one is the basics. And if you look at the reality and on the ground, we need to acknowledge that they have actually an understandable difficulty. We've done this work in 2021. Companies and the world is still kind of trying to recover from COVID-19. So this is a context in which these companies, they were, most of them actually fighting for survival, right? So of course, when you're in a situation like this, trying to make it to the end of the month or maybe the quarter, it's very difficult to start thinking about your triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet. So the first thing I want to say is that it's important to acknowledge this, right? We need to be quite pragmatic as well. And this is the situation in which most of the SMEs we've talked to during this process are. But I think what's interesting also is not just to say, this is what we see and there's nothing we can do. What we've seen also through this process, and we talked to more than 350 companies, is that some of them are doing this very well, right? So it's also good to look at those and see what are they doing differently. And I think here what we see is that they manage at some point to shift this from being a tension to being an opportunity. And actually these companies, they, at least now when we talk to them, they talk about how this focus on kind of the societal impact focus actually unlocked new opportunities for doing things differently in a way. And what we saw from these companies that was also interesting is that focusing on this aspect in a way helped them actually deal with some of the major challenges they had. So we've said before, access to finance and capital, for instance, is one of the challenge. The acquisition of talent and the retention of talent, for instance, is another one. When you talk to these SMEs that actually manage to take that pivot and make that shift, really starting to focus on societal impact, what they tell us is that this helped them solve most of this challenge. And it seems to start from a shift in the reputation and how they're seen. And this then helps for different things, as I mentioned, access to finance and capital, or really to attract talent, to retain it, and many other things. So I think here, again, acknowledging the difficult situation, but also looking at those that are doing it right and doing it well, it seems that there's a big shift here from seeing this as a constraint and finding ways to look at this as opportunities. Again, not saying this is an easy thing to do, but it's saying that this is something possible. And I think if you look at the numbers out there, right, and in Brazil, it might be different, but the average, and I think most countries are around this, 9 out of 10 companies are SMEs. 70% of employment is actually generated by SMEs. I think that according to the estimates, you would have close to 70% of global GDPs that is generated by SMEs. So I think here is really being quite pragmatic and see the reality, but also the the stakes are enormous and the potential is enormous. So I think it's very important really to build on some of those successful examples, to really trying to shift here the approach and start having those companies that are, of course, under tremendous pressure, start to see the opportunities that can be unlocked by progressive focus on things like societal impact.